Hello, everybody. Welcome to our second webinar of the ADF Educational Webinar Series. It's a pleasure to have you here. This is our second webinar. I'm going to give a little bit of context shortly. So we are the Ayahuasca Defense Fund, or the ADF. We have three main branches of action. One is legal counseling. The other is education or prevention. And the third one is advocacy or drug policy reform. We are hosting these webinars for free in hopes to create a larger understanding and clarifying obscure aspects regarding ayahuasca legality, but also other aspects of ayahuasca use. It's also our hope to strengthen our community and to create a larger network of people with kindred interests and people who would be willing to support each other, to hear each other, and to unite forces to change the current status quo on prohibition of ayahuasca, on criminalization of ayahuasca users, on prejudice, on stigmatization, on misunderstanding around this traditional, sacred, important practices in its different modalities. The first webinar was about ayahuasca, about the UDV case in the USA, which went all the way to the Supreme Court, a very hard case, and in many ways pioneer and groundbreaking kind of foundational case to all ayahuasca users around the globe. The first webinar was hosted by Jeffrey Bronfman, who, besides being a master from the UDV, is member of the steering committee of the Ayahuasca Defense Fund, alongside myself and other colleagues, whom I also greet here and thank for their important feedback and collaboration. And so Jeffrey spoke about the legal lessons that we could learn from the UDV's experience in the Supreme Court. Jeffrey is going to do a little recap for the second webinar today and give a little bit more of details. We have a large program. We have 3 speakers. So the dynamic of our webinar is going to be the following. First, Jeffrey will speak a little bit, and we'll start where we stopped in our last meeting, talking a general overview of the lessons we could learn about the UDV's experience in the US. Then Rob Heffernan and Jesse Hudson will speak as well. I would like to let you know that you have certain buttons below your screen. So we have turned the button raise your hand off, and the only button that we're going to be using is the question and answer. So you can write down your questions in your hand, in your mind, or in a paper, and then towards the end you can start putting your questions there. The questions are not going to be given for people to speak. Everything is going to be written. So I will read the questions and I will select the ones that I consider more pertinent. Unfortunately, we have to do a selection, so I hope you understand if your question doesn't get selected. And then the speakers are going to give their answers. So once again, welcome. I am Bia Labachi. I am part of the steering committee, and I'm also a research associate at the Ayahuasca Defense Fund. We're very enthusiastic about this topic. Needless to say, it has been a huge controversy in the US, the claim of certain groups that they were serving ayahuasca legally. It's not our job to point out what is true or not true or tell people what to do. But we're not here to criticize anybody or to create animosity, but we do want to touch on these controversial topics with a sober and objective and neutral and distance perspective, hoping to shed more light into public comprehension, both for policymakers and for the practitioners. So it's our hope that this creates a debate, a space of dialogue, and that all people practicing ayahuasca underground in the US learn better what are their rights and what are their obligations. So all that having said, I would like to welcome Jeffrey Bronfman, who I believe sincerely is a kind of classic in our field, and it's not necessary to present him too much, but Jeffrey, you're welcome to present yourself a little if you want, and the word is with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bia. Thank you to Vegetal and our colleagues at the Ayahuasca Defense Fund for this opportunity, and Bia for curating, these events and these webinars. I see it as something really valuable. I want to give a little bit of an introduction to part of my background that people may not be aware of who don't know me so well. I came to the use of psychotropic plants within an indigenous context more than 30 years ago. And then I've been working in the field of consciousness studies and social change for over 40 years. So that's part of the background that I bring to my conversation with you today. I closely accompanied the evolution of the law in the United States as it relates to the licensed use of otherwise controlled substances since 1990, when I was in a peyote ceremony on the night that the Supreme Court decided that the use of peyote was not protected by the Constitution of the United States. And that brought me into a very engaged interaction with a group of Indian civil rights advocates, religious leaders, and members of Congress to bring about a change in the law to give a certain consideration for the use of peyote within the Native American church, and hopefully the use of other plants that had a history of use in sacred and religious rites, to be able to open that as a possibility for what would be considered legitimate use of an otherwise controlled substance in the United States. And so I tracked the evolution of what became the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which I think is central to our conversation today, really from the time that it was conceived of in conversations that I was part of, and then through the process of it being approved by Congress and signed into law. So I'm pretty familiar with the topic of how the law has evolved and changed in the United States, and then certainly through the UDV case, where we brought the first successful challenge under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act for the legitimate or legitimized and recognized use of an otherwise controlled substance within a religious organization by a spiritual group, and then participated in several years of negotiations with the DEA after the Supreme Court had affirmed the lower court's decision that our religious practice needed to be accommodated under the laws of the United States. And I worked out and helped negotiate an agreement with the drug control authorities in the United States in order to be able to have a framework where our practice could be licensed and where our rights could be protected at the same time as the government's legitimate interests in terms of different aspects of their drug control policy could remain in force as well. So I have a perspective that I could offer to this whole conversation from that experience as well. Within the UDV, I've worked with the Sacrament of Ayahuasca for over 27 years, and I have been responsible for assisting in the establishment of the UDV in the United States and in several other countries. So that's part of the background that I bring to my presentation as well. I want to say that the previous webinar went over a lot of things in terms of an overview of the whole moment that we find ourselves in politically, legally, socially, spiritually, in this moment in human history from a global perspective. I started there to talk about the UDV case, but really there's many lessons that we learned within the context of our more than 10 years of litigation and additional conversations afterwards with the DEA in order to reach the level of legal guardianship that we've achieved today. And so so that's all there in the previous webinar that's available online. I will encourage people to hear it. I don't intend to go back over what was already said to any great degree today. Today's webinar is going to be different from the one that happened previously in that it's going to be entirely focused on the legal situation in the United States at this moment. And I think that it's hard to divorce legality from politics. There are political organs that end up writing the laws that are implemented as public policy and then become the framework within which we in an organized society are operate. And so the laws that they exist in the United States today have a very clear political component to them. And I think it's important to emphasize that in this political moment in the United States, which I don't need to talk about it at any length, it's a very delicate time to be engaging with the authorities in terms of the Drug Enforcement Agency and the Justice Department, because of the nature of the shift of political power and political focus in the United States. And I think that that's something that we need to be conscious of today. So I'm pretty much here to supplement the main presentations that are going to be given by Rob and Jesse. We've been working together over the past few weeks in preparation for this moment. I'm going to perhaps offer some comments at different points along the end, or available to answer questions. But I wanted to say that I feel that the timing of this particular webinar in terms of myths and realities with respect to the legal situation of ayahuasca is really timely and very, very important. And one thing I've seen is that there's a lot of misconceptions and a lot of misunderstandings in terms of some interpretations that people have about what really has been decided in the United States with respect to ayahuasca, and really what are issues that have left to be determined. And so I hope that we can address that today in this webinar to help empower and inform our community in terms of choices that you might want to make at this time in terms of your conduct with respect to your own works and your spiritual practice and relationship, or therapeutic practice in relationship to the use of what I consider to be a sacred tea of the Amazon. So I think it's important at this moment that we're sober. I think it's important that we're realistic. I think this idea of talking about some of the myths and dispelling them so that we can have a clearer sense of reality is really important. And I wanted to offer to you an experience I had early on with one of the elder mestres of the UDV, who was an important teacher for me. He's since passed on. But I asked him in one session, how do you discern between the things that appear to you when you're in a ceremony or in a session, in terms of things that come from the tea? How do you discern between what's reality and what is just perhaps an illusion that's presenting itself within the effect of the tea? And he looked at me and he smiled, and with the experience of somebody who'd been doing this for more than 50 years in this lifetime, looked at me and smiled and said, it takes years. It takes years to have that discernment. And I think that's an important point of departure, because often what we see is people having a connection to the sacred, to the divine, experiencing things that are revelatory openings for them, and then making certain assumptions about maybe a messianic calling or maybe a certain mission that they feel that they've been given. And sometimes we've seen people make some serious mistakes in terms of their interpretation of things that they saw, and maybe believing in things that were actually not real. And so I think that this is an important element of our spiritual development, to be able to discern between what's illusion and what's reality. And I'm hopeful that this conversation could contribute to all of our greater refinement of our understanding today. So with that, I'll give the word back to Bia, and so she could introduce the other presenters.
Hi, Jeffrey. Thanks. I want to echo your words. I think if we look to our own stories on how we all started in ayahuasca and how we evolved, we can also relate to what you're saying, how much in our own spiritual path and trajectory we change and we mature, and the ideas we had at the beginning are not the same, the ones that we hold now. So I think, that's an important piece of advice. People might be wondering, why are we talking about spiritual things, and why is the mastery of the UDV talking? I want to say that the ADF is an effort to make a dialogue between all kinds of knowledge, between expertise knowledge, scientific, academic, biomedical, anthropological, but also our own experiences as people who love ayahuasca, who have drank ayahuasca, who have personal insights and felt a call in their hearts to work for this cause at large. I also want to tell everybody that might be wondering that the ADF is not associated to any particular religious affiliation. So it's interesting that Jeffrey has his personal connections. He is also a member of our ADF steering committee. The next person who is going to speak is Rob. Rob has another personal history and background. So Rob has a long time experience both in the Santo Daime tradition and in the Peruvian Vegetalismo tradition. So we welcome and we incorporate multiple voices. I also want to make a call that if you who is watching us feel that you have something to add to this debate, we are open to incorporate new voices. Rob is not officially a member of the ADF, but we recognize in him a person with large experience, and therefore we invited him to join our efforts. So this is also a process that we are building, that it's in construction, and everybody's welcome to come. Rob has had a large experience in the Santo Daime North American Legal Committee for over 15 years, and he has also a strong foot in local Santo Daime or non-Santo Daime communities. He has participated in a lot of Facebook debates. He knows personally a lot of people, and that's also why what he has to say is important. He has played a role in the recent controversies that unfolded in the US. Rob also took the initiative of organizing a community forum in psychedelic science about legal dimensions and best practices in the ayahuasca community. That is a partnership between Rob and the ADF, which will be happening in Psychedelic Science 2017 in April, Oakland. So with that, I pass the word to Rob. And I also want to thank you, Rob, for making time and all your dedication to this with passion and integrity, and say we're very happy that you're here with us today.
Thank you, Bia. And I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to attend this webinar today and for being interested and concerned about this serious subject. It's an honor for me to help present this information so that we can all do our part to keep the ayahuasca community safe and protected. So my intention today is to try to help clear up some of the misunderstandings and mischaracterizations that have spread in the community about the legal status of ayahuasca, and also to recommend some sensible practices and guidelines that will help protect our use of the tea and support the well-being of participants. So let's begin. There are claims by some churches, groups, and individuals that they have an existing right to use ayahuasca and, in some cases, other entheogens. There are others that feel that they're well poised to get a religious exemption for ayahuasca from the DEA or to win in court if necessary. Then there are groups and individuals who believe it's okay to announce and promote their ceremonies on social media and websites. Some even allow online registration and PayPal payments. Given this, we need a more factual and realistic account of the legal status of ayahuasca to better assess these beliefs and behaviors. It's especially important given the new administration in Washington and the uncertainty about how they'll approach the growing use of ayahuasca and for requests for religious exemptions. So I'm going to quickly cover some legislation and court cases, and it may feel like a bit of information overload if you're hearing this for the first time. But no worry, we have a link in our resource section to a very good article by Gail Hypine titled The Legality of Ayahuasca Churches under ONAC. Excuse me. It reviews and explains in detail much of the same material I'm covering. So much of the questionable information about the legal status of ayahuasca is put out by a group called the Oklahoma Native American Church, or the ONAC. There's a number of controversies concerning them, but today what I want to address is the assertion that their members and branches have an existing legal right to use ayahuasca, cannabis, psilocybin, and other entheogens that are considered a controlled substance. Now, this claim isn't true. To understand why it's not true, we have to talk about the law and court case, which is very important to the ayahuasca community, yet often is misunderstood. I'm referring to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and the Supreme Court case involving it, won by the União de Vegetal, or UDV. The main plaintiff and chief strategist in that case was our good colleague, Jeffrey Bronfman, of course. The UDV uses ayahuasca as a central part of their religion. They refer to it as Ayahuasca. In 1999, the government seized a shipment of ayahuasca, maintaining that it was illegal under the Controlled Substance Act because it contained DMT, dimethyltryptamine. The UDV tried to negotiate with the government to have the ayahuasca returned and to have the religious use of it accommodated. Those negotiations failed. So the UDV went to court and they argued that they had the right to use ayahuasca pursuant to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Now, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act doesn't actually say anything about ayahuasca or any other controlled substance. What it does state is that the government can't interfere with a religious practice unless they can demonstrate that they have a compelling interest to enforce the law. And they can only enforce that law by the least restrictive means possible. If the government can't show a compelling interest to enforce the law, then they can't interfere with that religious practice. So in this case, the UDV's religious practices and beliefs were being interfered with because of the use of ayahuasca was considered in violation of the Controlled Substance Act. So for years, as Jeffrey mentioned, they battled the government in court using the Religious Freedom Restoration Act as a basis of their right to use ayahuasca. And they won at each level of the district and appellate divisions. So the case went to the Supreme Court, which ruled unanimously in favor of the UDV. The Supreme Court said that the government couldn't show that ayahuasca was a serious threat to the health and safety of the UDV's participants or to the broader public health, safety, and order. They essentially ruled that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act overruled the Controlled Substance Act in this case, that the government couldn't prove a compelling interest in enforcing that law. Now I'm giving a very simplistic and brief summary of the UDV case and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. As Jeffrey mentioned, he recently gave a webinar, a very good one, about winning the right to use ayahuasca, and I suggest you view that later. If you Google ADF Webinar 1 Bronfman, you'll find it right away. So this Supreme Court ruling in favor of the UDV's use of ayahuasca was a great win for religious freedom and for the responsible spiritual use of ayahuasca. Yet it's important to emphasize that while it created a legal precedent for other groups to follow, it did not make ayahuasca legal for anyone but the UDV. It did not make it legal to use any other controlled substance. So there's a group called the Santo Daime that Bia mentioned I'm also part of. We use ayahuasca as a central part of our religious practice. We call it Daime. The government also seized a shipment of Daime tea, and the Daime also tried to negotiate to no avail. Yet consider, when the UDV won their case in the Supreme Court, that ruling did not automatically make the Santo Daime's use of ayahuasca legal. The Santo Daime also had to go to court to assert their right to use Daime pursuant to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And they used the UDV's Supreme Court ruling as a precedent. So the Santo Daime won that case at the district level in Oregon. Yet that ruling only applied to the Santo Daime churches that brought the case in Oregon. The ruling did not apply to any other church or any other group to be able to legally use ayahuasca. It didn't even apply to other existing Santo Daime churches, only the churches that brought the suit in that district in Oregon. Now, since that ruling, the DEA has granted religious exemptions to 2 other Santo Daime churches to use ayahuasca. Yet, they had to apply for those exemptions, they had to be evaluated according to the court precedents, and they had to be approved. So just to quickly review what I just said, the UDV's Supreme Court ruling, a victory, only allowed the UDV, not any other group, to legally use ayahuasca, though it did set a precedent for other groups to follow. The Santo Daime victory in Oregon only allowed the Oregon churches who brought the case, but no other churches or groups to legally use ayahuasca. The DEA has now granted exemptions for other Santo Daime churches, yet they had to apply and qualify for those exemptions. So at the present time in the US, only the UDV and some branches of the Santo Daime can legally use ayahuasca. No one else can. If anyone says they can, they're either misunderstanding or mischaracterizing the facts. People assert that there's other laws that allow them to use ayahuasca. Excuse me. One is the Religious Land Use and Incarcerated Persons Act. Now, as the name of that law implies, it deals with religious land use and the religious rights of incarcerated persons. It mentions nothing about ayahuasca or any other entheogen, and there's no court case based on it that gives anyone the right to use ayahuasca. It's simply not relevant to the legality of ayahuasca at this time. Another law often mentioned is the American Indian Religious Freedom Act with its 1994 amendment that gives American Indians the right to use peyote. Now, that law certainly gives American Indians the right to use peyote. However, it does not give them or anyone else the right to use ayahuasca. People often bring up other laws and court cases concerning peyote. Let me briefly address those. There's a patchwork of state laws concerning peyote. They range from the relatively liberal, like in Oregon, which uses peyote where anyone can use peyote in a bona fide religious context, to the rather restrictive, like in Idaho, that restricts its use only to Indians in a Native American ceremony on an Indian reservation. Now, the ONAC, the group I mentioned earlier, they did win an important peyote case in Utah. In that case, the Utah Supreme Court, not the US Supreme Court, ruled that in Utah, anyone in a Native American church ceremony, Indian or non-Indian, had the right to use peyote. However, that ruling only applied to peyote, not to ayahuasca or any other entheogen, and it only applied in the state of Utah, nowhere else. So none of these peyote cases or laws gives anyone the right to use ayahuasca or any other entheogen. So in this brief tour of some laws and court cases, I hope it's clear that right now in the United States, only the UDV and some branches of the Santo Daime can legally use ayahuasca. And they can do this because they won court cases and or were granted a religious exemption from the DEA. Peyote law and court cases do not make ayahuasca legal for anyone. And again, like I said, I threw a lot at you quickly. I urge you to read that article that we have linked in our resource section, The Legality of Ayahuasca, Churches Under the ONAC by Gail Hypon. It's a really great article with a lot of good detail. Now, I mentioned earlier that in the US, there's a number of groups and individuals who announce and promote their ceremonies on Facebook pages and other sites. And there's others who feel that if they filed a religious exemption request with the DEA, or if they went to court, that they'd be approved for an exemption. Many believe that they're already similarly situated to the UDV and Santo Daime. Yet these assumptions may be seriously flawed. I say this because the courts have made rulings on what criteria let me say it again. The courts have made rulings on criteria that constitute a religion. They're referred to as the Myers criteria. So it's very important that if you're claiming that ayahuasca is central to your religious practice, that you need to know how you would fit in with these criteria. So the Myers criteria would ask things like this. Is there an authentic, ongoing congregation of participants? Are there coherent spiritual practices involving instruction, guidance, fellowship? Are participants involved with things like learning songs, prayers, ritual norms? Is there an emphasis on how to live an ethical and moral lifestyle? Is there an articulation and discussions of foundational ideas about life, death, and purpose? Are the practices and beliefs in the religion comprehensive, meaning do they involve many aspects of life and spiritual practice, or is it more a singular focus, say, on drinking ayahuasca? And are there discussions and study about the lineage, the founders, the key teachers and guides of the tradition? Or does the ceremony seem more like a paid retreat or workshop, similar to retreats in South America or healing modalities you might find in New Age or yoga centers? The question is this: if an ayahuasca ceremony is primarily oriented to therapeutic, energetic, and physical healing, then it wouldn't necessarily meet the Myers criteria. It wouldn't necessarily be considered a religious practice. Now, let me acknowledge this is a complex and delicate matter and delicate point. The healing in many forms plays an important role in most religions. And ayahuasca has a long history of use with many variations and practices, and many people have benefited from the different South American healing traditions, myself included. Yet those healing traditions might not readily be recognized by the courts or the DEA as religious practices. In fact, many curanderos don't necessarily see themselves as religious teachers or guides, and many retreat centers in South America don't often claim to be churches or spiritual communities. Again, they might seem more like alternative healing and yoga centers that offer therapeutic healing modalities, and many ayahuasca ceremonies in the US seem to be of a similar nature. And by the way, I'm not judging that way of working, not at all, but just saying we need to be oriented towards what the law is. And at the same time, I'm aware that there are ayahuasca circles in the US that are involved in the curandero and shamanistic traditions that certainly are religious spiritual communities that could very well meet the Myers religious criteria, that could very well be considered churches, temples, religious fellowships, which is why it's so important to research and discuss these issues. It's especially important if you consider filing for a religious exemption to seek expert legal advice from the Ayahuasca Defense Fund, from lawyers with expertise and experience in religious law and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. In the question and answer section, I hope we can engage in some more dialogue about these issues, because as I said, they're nuanced, they're involved, and they're delicate. I'm going to close my section with 7 recommendations and practices that could give a measure of protection and safety to those using ayahuasca. Now, some of these recommendations include key components that are involved in getting religious exemptions. However, I'm not offering these as a blueprint to get an exemption. That's a very involved enterprise, and it's beyond my capacity. And I'm also not saying that if you follow these recommendations, they're going to make you legal. However, they will lay good groundwork for well-being and protection, and they are oriented to the spirit of the law. So let me start. 1, be discreet. Please don't publicly promote your ceremonies. If you publicly promote your ceremonies, you risk attention from the DEA and the media. Attention not just for yourself, but to the broader community. We're all in this together, and we all need to cultivate care and discretion to support each other. So please, don't publicly promote your ceremonies. 2, as I mentioned earlier, please don't consider to seek an exemption until you consult with people like the Ayahuasca Defense Fund, with experts in the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and religious laws. This is so important because what we do in this regard has consequences for the wider ayahuasca community. We all need expert advice, guidance, and cooperation when dealing with these complex religious matters. And as myself, Jeffrey, and Bia mentioned earlier, given the new political situation in Washington, we're at a very delicate time with this. 3, be attentive to the health and well-being of participants. Now, this is obvious, and many people do a pretty good job of it already. It's also a key component for receiving an exemption. Let's just review some of the specifics. Conduct face-to-face interviews with potential participants and screen them for and review their medical, psychological, and spiritual history. Review any medications people may be taking for possible interactions with fatigue. Have people sign waivers in which the participants acknowledge the possible challenges involved with the work and accept responsibility for their participation. Be prepared and have training for spiritual, psychological, and physical emergencies. This is really important. And follow up with participants after the ceremony. 4, secure your tea in a locked refrigerator, cabinet, or secure space. This is another key component that addresses the government's concerns about diversion. It would also prevent a young person from getting their hands on it and possible theft, etc. 5, keep track of your inventory. Record the amount served on each occasion. This is also another key exemption component that addresses the government's concerns about diversion. 6, document the history and lineages of your group, your teachers, founders, guides, your core practices, beliefs, traditions, ritual norms. These are also aspects of the Myers religious criteria. And 7, consider consulting with lawyers about incorporating as a church. That can help build a legal foundation. It can firm up the integrity of your endeavor and give you some clarity and protection around handling money, land use, liability issues. And even if you don't actually incorporate, following the guidelines to do so may help set the stage to protect you in the future. And again, please be discreet. Don't publicly promote your ceremonies. And please don't consider an exemption without expert advice from experts in religious law and Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Well, I've said a lot quickly here, and I'm sorry I couldn't go into more depth at the minute. We can address these and other issues in the Q&A. And as Bia said, we're going to be hosting a community forum in April at the MAPS Psychedelic Science Conference. It's in Oakland. We'll discuss these and other related matters of harm reduction, and we'll create further platforms to interact around these issues. So I'm going to hand it over to Jesse now. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. I see Bia speaking over there. So we'll transfer to her and then transfer back.
Oh, hi, thanks for that, Rob. I think your explanation was brilliant. And I just feel so excited because I truly feel that we are like navigating like the curve of history. This is so pioneer, this is so new to all of us. We're really building together history here. I feel this, I feel this emotion. Of course, I'm a little bit biased because I love this subject, but I really think that this is unique. I have never seen a lecture like this in my life. I think maybe we could even create the Rob Hefferman's test, and we're gonna make people do a checklist before they start, going around the internet saying things. Because it was such a sober and calm and focused and intelligent approach, showing all the subtleties, just, a lot of common sense things, such as different states in the USA have different laws, different substances have different implications. Winning a court case is not the same as being legal. So in a nutshell, you just offered, I feel, complete in alignment with the mission of the ADF, that we're here trying to dissipate some of the common sense and the myths that circulate as a kind of urban lore that goes around and people start reproducing. I want to say that the title of this webinar is Myths and Reality. The next webinar, it's also going to follow the same lines about myths and realities between the continuities and discontinuities between DMT and ayahuasca. And we also have a myth and reality section in our website. So I want to remind everybody that the ADF is trying to bridge this, gap between common sense and also superficial journalistic work and reality. So I just wanted to thank you, Rob, again, and pass the word to the next presenter. I also want to say that I'm very happy that Jesse took us up for the challenge. Jesse is a young lawyer, very enthusiastic. We're also working as co-authors and colleagues. He's a research associate at the Ayahuasca Defense Fund. He is co-responsible with Constanza Sanchez and myself for the legal section of our website, which I invite everybody also to visit. You click on a country and boom, you have the status of ayahuasca in that country. That magic, that guy is one of the person behind that magic. When you read, and we're going to be publishing some of that. Jesse is not only a legal lawyer, but he has also training in anthropology, so I feel he has a lot to contribute. And I also want to thank Jesse for his openness and pass you the word. Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you, Bia, for that wonderful introduction. I want to say it's a huge honor for me to be speaking alongside you and Jeffrey and Rob. You couldn't have chosen three people with more experience in this world. So it's a huge honor for me. For my small part, what I'm going to try to do here over the next 15 minutes is to demystify an occult process. And that's not shamanic journeying, I'm sorry. It's actually something far more mysterious. The process a church needs to go through to obtain a religious exemption to use ayahuasca without too much fear of prosecution. As a sneak preview, it involves the Myers criteria that Rob introduced us to a few minutes ago. And to reiterate Rob's clarification on the current state of the law, the only ayahuasca churches with permits to use ayahuasca in the States are the UDV and, to a limited extent, Santo Daime. To reiterate his key advice, don't apply for an exemption, even though I'm going to explain a little bit more about it to you, without seeking expert advice first. At the end of these 15 minutes, you should understand what a petition for a religious exemption is, what the petition submitted by the new ayahuasca church, Ayahuasca Healings, looked like, and what a church might do to have a successful one. As a disclaimer, this is not intended as legal advice, and this does not create an attorney-client relationship. So let us just willingly suspend our disbelief for a second and imagine that the DEA is, or at least was before the current administration, not a bad guy, but rather open to working with people using plant sacraments. Now, this is not so far-fetched as it might seem. In December, the DEA reconsidered its emergency ban of kratom, which is an ethnobotanical used to treat, for some people, opiate addiction, in response to public lobbying about the effectiveness of kratom as a treatment in treating this opidemic sweeping the states. So in order to prevent the opidemic, the DEA showed that it was willing to listen to people using plants like kratom. And I think we should keep that in mind here with ayahuasca. In fact, I submit to you that the DEA is so willing to listen that it is sending out invitations to apply for religious exemptions. Ayahuasca Healings got an invitation from the DEA last January, and the church SoulQuest got an invitation as well more recently. The religious exemption process is, in fact, a special process that the DEA created specifically for the purpose of enabling people to use otherwise illegal plant sacraments without fear of prosecution. The process is called, in full, the Petition for a Religious Exemption to the CSA pursuant to RFRA. And we focus on this for three reasons. One, to be prepared. The DEA is going to ask any new church that it learns about to submit a petition. Two, to know the options. Option one is this petition, and option two is far more costly and will take far longer, and that's the judicial route to legalization, taken by Santo Daime and the UDV in court. Third, we focus on the petition to illuminate the way. Understanding the elements of the petition will guide a prospective new ayahuasca church towards a protected religious practice. Understanding what the government is looking for, although church and state should remain very much divided, and it's important to keep in mind that the government does have the limited capacity to review the sincerity of religion or the legitimacy of religion, we can still help guide new religions into good form. So diving right into it, there are three elements to a petition, tracking the three elements of RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Element number one is the exercise of a real religion. Now, this is the crux for ayahuasca churches because you can figure that out for yourself. Now, the DEA weighs three elements of a religion. One is fundamental and ultimate questions that address a reality beyond the physical world. Two, a comprehensive moral and ethical system. And three, structural characteristics of religions generally. These Myers criteria that Rob introduced us to. Now, I will share the answers that Ayahuasca Healings gave for each of these in just a minute. Element two is sincerely held beliefs. For this, the DEA does a kind of lie detector test. They look at whether there are indicators of insincerity in the responses of the church. Indicators of insincerity are like ad hoc beliefs that appear to be put together after the fact in order to justify applying for a petition, to the use of other illegal substances, such as San Pedro or Sanango or Sananga. 3, the lack of ceremony or ritual, such as infrequent meetings. And 4, evidence of commerce, such as retreats for suggested donations posted online and advertisements. Now, going back to the crux, a real religion, we ask, how might an ayahuasca church send the crux, as they say in climbing? In order to send the crux, they need to prove 3 elements of religion. Number 1, this fundamental questions about life, purpose, and death, addressing a reality beyond the physical world. Are shamanic beliefs enough to do this? This belief in a spiritual world that one can access through shamanic journeying? What Ayahuasca Healings did is they cited their belief in the existence of this metaphysical shamanic spirit world. Their belief in a great spirit, similar to a theistic spirit being, their understanding of the purpose of life, which they said is environmental stewardship, based on a rejection of mind-body dualism in Cartesian philosophy. And with those, they seem to satisfy it to some degree. Number 2, the second element of a religion, this comprehensive moral and ethical system governing behavior. Question is, are diets enough, like a prescribed ayahuasca diet? And the answer is probably not. A church likely needs more than just a diet to have a comprehensive moral and ethical system. Ayahuasca Healings cited its environmental stewardship, describing the consequences of breaking these sacred duties to the environment as akin to the Hindu principle of karma. They said that they adopted the code of conduct from the Okle-Vueha Native American Church, this licensing body that Rob introduced us to, which includes prescriptions for behavior towards women, children, family, and community, and even requires pledges such as, I commit to making effort to spend each day in meditation and prayer, and a promise to not sell medicines to those who are not members of the Okle-Vueha Native American Church. Moving on to the third element, structural and external signs characteristic of religions in general. Are ceremonies enough? No, likely not. You need formal ceremonies, you need gathering places, clergy, prophets, organizational structure or hierarchy, efforts at propagation, diet and fasting, and belief in supernatural entities. Ayahuasca Healings, to satisfy those, said that it had a sweat lodge in terms of formal ceremonies, a purgative ritual cleansing the body and the mind, the ritualized consumption of ayahuasca, which it likened to Catholic communion and the consumption of wine and a wafer in order to obtain communion with the divine. They stated that their gathering place was a sacred teepee they erected on their land in Washington. Their clergy and prophets consisted of shamans with training as curanderos in the Amazon jungle. Its organizational structure consisted of an executive body with 3 members: Trinity, who was the visionary director; Kambuja Banyantri, who is the chief medicine man and church director; and a creative director and spiritual guide. Now, touching on its efforts at propagation, as I'm sure you all became familiar with Ayahuasca Healings through, they admitted that they went a little overboard on Facebook and in social media, advertising their role as the first public legal ayahuasca church in the United States. And as a penance for that to the DEA, they offered to cede the right of pre-publication review and authorization to anything they published to the DEA. Moreover, they said that they'd readjusted their spiritual ambitions to a fuller understanding of the societal parameters and cultural and legal barriers to their dreams by dropping their stated goal of opening up 200 ayahuasca churches and focusing on just one. Going on, they describe their diet in detail, and they describe the supernatural entities they believe in, not only Mother Ayahuasca, Father San Pedro, and the Great Spirit, but also thousands of angels and the ascended masters, Buddha and Jesus, and animistic plant, animal, and mountain spirits. Now, pulling back for a second and looking at it from 30,000 feet, Ayahuasca Healings petition appears to succeed to some degree in at least demonstrating the three elements of a religion. So you could say, in other words, that they sent the crocs. The problem is they appear to fail in two different ways. These indicators of insincerity, the lie detector test that the DEA uses. Number one is the admitted evidence of other substances, including San Pedro. And number two is the evidence of commerce. This price tag they gave for the ceremonies and their way of going about things that seemed marketing focused. And that's it. That's all I have for analyzing Ayahuasca Healings petition. And thank you very much for the time. Back to Bia.
Hi, Jesse. Thanks for your contribution. I also think it's exciting to see this topic addressed. This is definitely, information and more serious than what we see circulating around the internet. I want to say that the nature of this topic is so controversial and so complex, and that we are not aiming here to, set the parameters of truth, but we're rather calling everybody to sit together on a big dialogue and trying to advance the current state of affairs. I want to say that these things are very new, and also our interpretations are under construction, and we are, we don't have everything formed and clear. And again, this is a community effort that everybody contributes for us to build this knowledge. And to build this knowledge, hey, you need to have access to the original legal exemptions. Hey, you need to have access to what the DDA has said. So we are voluntary our time and our work to build this database. A part of the mission of the ADF is to make sources available. So we don't claim we own the truth, but we're putting these documents online, and we're going to be posting on our website and our Facebook a bunch of references for all of you that want to further study these materials. We also invite you to write to us, to give your feedback, and to help us have access to these documents. If you have filed letters to the DEA, or if you have access to people who have done that, please send them to us. And we're going to move now towards the question and answers session. But before we do that, I'd like to give Jeffrey the opportunity to make any comment. I think he's, a senior among us in experience. When we were starting to all think about this, he was already there, having a lot of meetings to talk about the subject. So I was wondering, Jeffrey, do you want to throw any 2 cents into what Rob and Jesse said before we move into the Q&A?
Yeah, I also want to congratulate both Jesse and Rob for their presentations. I felt it was really helpful, and I agree with everything that was said. There's only a couple of small points that I want to clarify. The first was Jesse referred to the Oklahoma Native American Church as some kind of a licensing body. And I think that's a misunderstanding of how they would like to present themselves, as if they have the authority to give licenses to authorize people to use otherwise controlled substances in their ceremonies. That's how they position themselves. And I think that's where a lot of people have been misdirected. They don't have that authority. No church can give the authority for somebody to violate the law in terms of using a substance that's controlled by the government. The authority to do that only rests with the DEA, not with the Oklahoma Native American Church or any other organization. Secondly, the notion of that there's 2 routes for people to pursue legitimacy, one being the judicial route, the other being the administrative route. The reality today is that you have to go through the administrative route first in order to have access to the courts. If you try to go to a court without having gone through the administrative route, and there is an administrative route that's open, the judge will say, you have an administrative remedy that's available to you. You have to exhaust that first before you could go to a court and have the judge give you, a judicial, exemption. So that's something that's also evolved as a result of the UDV case. When we filed our motion, we anticipated the argument that they would make that we had to follow an administrative procedure, but they didn't have an administrative procedure at that time. Today they do. So anybody who goes to court without having gone through the process that the DEA has now employed is likely to find a judge, after spending a lot of time and money, tell them you have to go back and go through the administrative authority of the DEA. I can't do that until they've denied you. I can't review your case until you've been denied. What RFRA gives is access to the courts to people who have been denied an exemption on the part of the government. The last thing is what you both, Jesse, referred to as the crux of the matter, and Rob explained a little bit about what was called the Myers criterion. I should want to give a little bit of background into that. Matthew Myers was a person from the state of Wyoming who had sent cannabis to himself. He was arrested for it and prosecuted for his use of the controlled substance being cannabis. He claimed that his use of it was religious. He brought a claim for religious use to the courts. I believe this was in the early mid-1990s. The courts ruled against him and basically found that he was not sincere and that it wasn't a real religious practice. And what they did in helping to refine the law or the analysis of the law for other courts that might follow was to find certain criteria about what was commonly found in legitimate religious traditions, not as a way of limiting it, but saying these are the things that you will commonly find in religion. So that was in a federal case in the state of Oregon that then went to the Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. And the 10th Circuit affirmed those criteria and published it in their opinion. So that's the highest level that way of evaluating cases is reached. It's not universal. It doesn't apply in every state. It doesn't even apply in the federal level beyond the 10th Circuit, but it is a guideline that people should consider, and I think it's a very good guideline in terms of how to orient yourself if you want to come forward with a religious claim for an exemption, what kind of criteria you should look to have evidenced and documented. And I also think that the point that Rob made about the care in interviewing potential participants and orientations during the ceremony and care after the ceremony is really important, because on the enforcement side, in terms of what cases the DEA might select to prosecute if they decide to go the prosecutorial route, those would be cases where there have been complaints, where people have been either profiteering or perhaps things happen in the ceremonies where people are not safe, or if there's some unfortunate medical situation that happens that wasn't properly considered. There was a case in Canada, for example, that came to the awareness of the authorities where there was somebody who died in a ceremony. The reason that they died, they were an elderly person, they were not in good health, and actually was tobacco poisoning, because the actual ayahuasca preparation had large amounts of tobacco leaves in it, and so it was actually nicotine poisoning that the autopsy showed was the cause of death. But still, the shaman was prosecuted for practicing medicine without a license and was ultimately deported, not jailed. So this factor of being responsible for people and to doing the best within the practices that Rob recommended and other considerations to ensure the safety of people who are coming to the ceremonies, I think is vital, to make sure that there are not complaints or elements that are where people call the authorities in terms of claiming that there's some kind of activity that's potentially illegal and bringing a difficult situation to people involved. That's it.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I want to also tell people that are watching us that one of the main problems that we face studying ayahuasca is a real lack of data on how many people actually are drinking ayahuasca. It's very hard to have an assessment of what is going on the underground. Much more research is needed on this way. So if you're watching this webinar because you're doing some kind of PhD or master thesis project and you're looking for a topic, I think that mapping out this underground and having some more statistics and quantitative numbers on how many people are doing these things, it would be helpful, because unfortunately we just have access to problematic cases. It's or most likely we hear about problematic cases. I have the intuition that we're still having very little problems compared to how much people are drinking ayahuasca. So there's a large activity going on the underground, but just a few cases pop out there. It would be helpful to know more this proportion. So now we're going to pass to the questions and answers. And I'm going to throw a first question to Jeffrey himself again. I hope I'm not asking too much, Jeffrey. I would like to know, and this is rather speculative, so as we know, there's lots going on in the underground, people drinking ayahuasca all over the States. I would even dare saying that perhaps in every single city of the country, there's ayahuasca rituals going on. It seems to have really spread a lot. People have tried to guess. I think I read in the New Yorker that some researchers said in New York, there's every weekend 100 ceremonies. I don't know where that data is coming from. But in any case, I think that it's apparent that the government has not really tried to persecute a lot of this use so far. If we believe our intuitions and our ethnographic experience and first-hand observation that there is a lot going on, we still hear very little about it. We had some cases which are these important ones, but I would like to ask two things. Why do you think that, if you agree with me that the government has not focused a lot up to now on persecuting this underground use? And if you agree, why do you think that's the posture they have taken so far? And two, do you think that this tendency might change under Trump administration?
Difficult, questions to answer, and I agree with you that they're I don't think that the size of the use is near the kind of exaggerated claims that some have made. I really don't know, and I do think it's important for us to find out. And I think it's dangerous to exaggerate it. I know in our case there was testimony that the Native American Church had several 100,000 members in it, and I know for a fact that that's somewhat of an exaggeration in terms of the actual practice of the Native American Church. So I think we need to be careful about citing numbers. I think your perception that it's not a priority for the Drug Enforcement Administration in terms of prosecution is accurate. And in terms of why I think that is, again, this is only pure speculation on my part. I think that they're more concerned with what they perceive to be drugs that are dangerous drugs, that are drugs of abuse. And I don't think that there have been the kind of complaints that have necessitated them taking some kind of a strong enforcement stance. But the other factor is that they've also had two losses, significant losses in court. One that went all the way to the Supreme Court, in our case, where they took an action against the UDV, and then and they gave a very strong defense, pretty much putting out all their arguments about why they couldn't allow this, and court after court after court rejected those arguments. So I think that they went through a re-education process in terms of what the law allows for and the responsibility that they have in terms of drug enforcement when it starts to interfere with this most personal and sacred area of our life in terms of our spiritual practice and our connection to the sacred. So I think that they're reticent to bring forward a case and lose again. And so I think that what we're likely going to be seeing is them, if they prosecute, it's within a case that they feel is winnable, where there's some use that is questionable in terms of not really religious, or where there's some hidden commercial element that's going on, or some form of exploitation that's happening. And so I think that it's a prosecutorial decision, and they make those prosecutorial decisions very carefully because they don't want to lose again in court, because that sets a precedent that has all kinds of implications. So one way of looking at it is that maybe they're looking for cases that they could start to reverse the movement towards greater liberalization and greater accommodation into cases where there's a more bright line in terms of what they're, what's impermissible, you know, and it's a very delicate area of the law that's still being defined. What is a religion? What is legitimate use? What is responsible use? All these things are still being defined by the practice of people like ourselves. And so I think that this is the reason why, as I see it, if there has been more of a movement, it's out of a lot of care, that they want to choose very carefully how they're going to respond. And to the extent that these movements are happening in a way that's safe, that there's no evident social harm other than the speculative harm that they brought forward in our case, that the court said wasn't enough for them to prevail on a religious freedom, you know, Restoration Act standard. I think that that's what we're looking at is a recalibration within the enforcement division about what cases they choose to prosecute and why.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thanks, Jeffrey. Next round of questions to Rob. So Rob, you mentioned en passant 2 Santo Daime churches that got exemptions recently. Can you clarify which churches are they and how did they get this exemption? And the other one is a more generic question. So I just want to like create a scenario of a, you know, let's imagine a group. Let's imagine a group that is using ayahuasca and they have integrity. They're interested that the people get a good screening before, they talk to people afterwards. They have gone to South America a few times and they trained and they take it seriously. They have that deer in their hearts. They charge money, but they're not really making a living off of this because they're covering the expenses, but they have jobs. And they have some kind of belief in spirituality and nature, in connection, in integration between people, and they dream of a better world, and they sincerely believe that ayahuasca is a helpful tool in their spiritual path. Do you think that that's enough to make them a church or a religion? How can we translate those categories that you know, both Jeffrey and you mentioned? And by the way, this number of questions, this characteristics are posted on our site, the kind of elements that the government would take into account to considering it a religion. In other words, my question is that enough to characterize a group as a religion or not, in your opinion? And I know that it's a guess because we don't have a lot of historical examples beforehand. Also want to tell the public that remind them that the place to make the questions is the Q&A button. That's where I'm reading the questions from. Thank you.
Well, let me answer that second one first. As you said, we don't have any cases about this yet, so it is speculation. In the way you describe that group, the way, what I would think is if they carefully looked at what they actually believed, how they behaved, and how they practiced, they probably would have good grounds, but they'd really have to write it down, consider it, think it out, and really chart it out. Because the truth is, a lot of people that are practicing in these shamanistic curandero traditions do have a lot of spiritual ground underneath them, but they haven't, they haven't, unlike the Santo Daime and the UDV that have a long history of documentation, they don't have that. So you really have to really do a soul searching and then a mind searching to really get it down. Because if you just try to, cut and paste things that exist in other places, then it's going to look insincere, even if you are sincere. So it's really a process. And I'm specifically thinking about some groups I know that they started out more as a traditional curandero vegetalismo groups from Peru that were connected more to a healing tradition. But as time went on, they actually turned into real spiritual communities, partly because the people involved had their own spiritual practices that affected the group, yogic practices, Buddhist practices, but also they were influenced by the Native American church and the Santo Daime, and they actually cohered into a real spiritual community. But without documentation, it's going to be hard. In your first question about the Santo Daime churches, I actually don't want to name them, because even though these churches are legal, both the Santo Daime and the UDV, it's true of two, people are still discreet, and we don't publicize ourselves, we don't really promote ourselves. We're open and allow people to come to us, but we're not trying to proselytize. I can say that one church is in California and the other is in the Northwest, and the way they got the exemption was, the Spirit called them to do that. They were actually connected with the same lineage, the same specific lineage of the Oregon churches that got the exemptions, and they used the same lawyers. So, they were well poised, both in terms of their practice, in terms of their doctrine, in terms of their behaviors, and in terms of having the same legal advice.
Hey, thanks, Rob. I'm so puzzled by certain things that I'm going to take the liberty to add a little think to my question for you, because I just think that you're fantastically positioned in your empirical experience with both models, like the Brazilian ayahuasca style, Brazilian ayahuasca religions, and curandero vegetalismo. So I want to add to that question of our imagined group, which we all, I think, have personal contact with. How do you link money into that equation? How can you be a spiritual community and have spiritual goals, but also do retreats that are paid, and actually the membership is paying to attend a spiritual work or paying to attend the rituals? Do you think that these things are contradictory? And let me clarify that my question is not moral, and I'm not here to judge. I want to understand, let's wear the hat of the government, and let's try to understand the current status quo so we can navigate this status quo. If you create a circle that people have to pay, let's say $250 to join each time, but you also do potlucks and gatherings, how do you think this would read if it went all the way up in a licensing process? Or rather, what would you recommend for people that are trying to do things in the most responsible and ethical and have integrity and have their higher chances of recognition if they want to go legal?
Well, that's a very good question, and that's on a lot of people's minds. And there's several ways, I think, to approach it. One is just in the big picture, there's other religions, whether they be Christian tradition or Buddhist traditions, that have retreats, and of course people pay to go on those retreats because there's just money involved in renting spaces and having food and all the different things that are involved with that. So there isn't necessarily a barrier there about money in that way. Where it's problematic in, I think, a lot of ayahuasca ceremonies is that it could at least look like you're paying directly to have this experience with a controlled substance. That's what the government would be, I think, concerned about and looking at. So the way around that, well, not so much the way around it, the way through it, both organizationally and ethically, I think, would be for people to actually create, as much as possible, create memberships, create tithings where you get the money you need for your organization to continue, for you to get your medicine, to pay the people who are the guides who, this might be part of their income. And that's not necessarily a problem. There's people who are religious professionals get paid and they have to pay taxes on their personal income. There's not necessarily a problem with that. But it really does need to be thought out. And but for smaller groups, there's an issue just that, As a practical matter, it just might be that when you come to a ceremony, it's easier to collect money there for that particular ceremony. There, then, it might be good to think of both how the Santo Daime works on some local levels, but also how Buddhist groups work, where in both of them, while a donation is asked for, no one is refused for lack of money. That's, again, both in the Santo Daime, but also in Buddhist groups. And if a situation is you have to rent, let's say, a hall because you have a larger congregation, that the money that needs to be paid is to go into that, but no one's donations are only given for the people who are taking money to help lead the works and so on like that. I mean, it's a very intricate and nuanced subject. But the biggest legal issue would be that if it looks like, and especially if it is, that people are just paying for a ceremony, especially if you don't really have an ongoing congregation. If you're really someone putting on ceremonies, you have the ceremony, and pretty much that's it until maybe a few months later with the next ceremony, that could very well look like, and maybe would be more like an alternative healing modality that's kind of like a business. And maybe Jeffrey has some thoughts on that too.
Hey, thanks for that. I'm sure Jeffrey has lots of thoughts on everything. But let's give the word to our young, energetic collaborator, Jesse. Jesse, could you give a very short update on what's going on with both Ayahuasca Healing and Soul Quest in terms of exemptions filed, answers, letters, exchange between them and the DA very shortly?
Yes, absolutely. So Ayahuasca Healings submitted its petition on April 4th of last year. They have not yet heard back. So, and as far as we can judge from their timetable, about a year, if not more, is what a church should expect to wait after submitting a petition. Soul Quest, which I didn't touch on much, but is another church out there applying for an exemption, haven't applied yet, although our sources close to Soul Quest say that they're putting together documents, getting ready to submit. Now, with Jeffrey's advice here and Rob's advice here, and the general key point of this webinar, that right now the political time is so sensitive that it might be good to proceed with extreme caution relative to the amount of caution they proceeded with last year. Maybe Soul Quest will take some more time to make a very measured and careful decision. So as it is, they have not submitted their petition, and we're waiting on a response from the DEA for Ayahuasca Healings petition.
Thank you. So we're kind of, 5 minutes to go, but let's give ourselves 5 minutes more because we were 5 minutes late, so I think that's fair. So hopefully we can have a last quick round with our three wonderful panelists. Jeffrey, somebody's asking, what are the chances if somebody's caught with ayahuasca somewhere, either in the airport or in a ceremony, that they claim that they are related to the UDV or the Daime? Could they get away with it?
Yeah, I would not recommend that approach. Each one of the UDV centers is individually registered with the DEA, and each one of our members and the criteria for membership is very clearly defined. So if somebody would make a statement to that effect and it wasn't true, it would be another thing that could be used against them in a prosecution. So I would not advise people making statements that aren't true. The way that the UDV procedures are managed by the DEA, as well as the Daime procedures, which reflect the UDV's procedures, are very specific, and somebody just can't claim that they're a member when they're not.
I have another question for you, Jeffrey. Another question, I think that this is a larger question. I feel it's more appropriate to pose it to you. And also, I think it's a large academic discussion, which is actually done by a colleague, anthropologist. She's asking Christina Calicott, what are the possibilities of redefining religion in larger terms, or just that the legitimate uses of ayahuasca might include other things such as medical or therapeutic uses, more like in a Western clinical settings? Do you think we have that chance? Are we very far in history? How do you see the future?
That's a really good question, and I'm happy to give you my thoughts, on it as they're still forming. In the progression, I think it would be, the next step would be to recognize shamanic uses where there's a long spiritual lineage and a healing practice to be legitimate in terms of a movement towards a more comprehensive view of religion. I think a view that's exclusively medical or exclusively therapeutic is a different kind of conditions that you need to go through. In order to have a therapeutic practice, for example, licensed and recognized, there's a whole procedure that you have to go through, perhaps with the medical authorities or with the FDA, that's different than the procedure for getting a religious exemption. So I think this idea of ayahuasca being a valuable tool in a healing context, moving a next step from the religious context, I think, would be a legitimate shamanic context where there's a proven foundation of use in a healing modality that's gone back for centuries, that could be proven anthropologically and in terms of the social sciences, that then could bring forward another context that has a spiritual foundation. I know, for example, in the case of Taiwan, who was apprehended for the importation of ayahuasca in the United States and had a shamanic lineage that he was working with. One of the considerations when the DEA was looking to prosecute him was whether or not shamanism was actually a religion. And I think that that's a question that different people could come to different conclusions about. And I think that decision might be reached differently by different judges and different venues sitting on different courts. But I think that in the movement towards a greater definition of spirituality and religion and healing practices, my sense is the next step would be finding a way where shamanism, within a long history of practice that involved healing, was recognized as legitimate. And I think that could be the next step. But I don't see it as jumping from the religious exemption to a therapeutic exemption or a medical exemption anytime soon.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Hey, Rob, what about you? What do you think about the same question?
Well, it's interesting. I'm in ayahuasca.com right now. There's a discussion about that very point, about that kind of, in between area. And people are just beginning to think about, could there be professional associations of, let's say, shamanic use that in some way might be like, the way Chinese medicine works so differently, but it would be something in that domain. It wasn't completely medicalized, therapeutic, it wasn't religious. And so people are just beginning to really think about that and how they could organize themselves to move in that direction. And then there's the other question about shamanism itself is a religion. The word encompasses so many things that, the answer is, yes, no, and maybe.
Okay, maybe that's going to be a motto for us in this work. Yes, no, maybe. Jesse, I want to make a question for you from Oliver Parker. I think he has a profile similar to you. He says, I'm currently writing my undergraduate anthropology dissertation concerned with Santo Daime. How can I best frame my work as to support future legalization and greater liberty? So it's a kind of question between the relationship between research and legality, anthropology and legality. What do you think?
Well, Oliver, and anybody else who's an undergraduate or graduate writing a thesis about ayahuasca right now, I think the best way to frame the work in order to support future legalization and greater liberty is to focus on the concrete scientific evidence that's already out. And in reviewing that, help shape the narrative to show the positive effects of regular ayahuasca use as shown through the ayahuasca study, as well as other more recent studies on the effectiveness of the use of ayahuasca within a religious context as a sacrament that is within institutionalized framework that provides much of what's lacking in ayahuasca culture outside of religious culture, such as integration and community.
Okay, there's somebody asking here a question for ICEERS. I don't think we have an official representative of ICEERS, but the question has to do with the ADF. So the person is asking if ICEERS, but I think maybe meant ADF, would be supporting groups that want to do file exemption. So I think that following Rob's motto, yes, no, and maybe, it's not, our exact job to do that, but we are in the position to try to give advice. So we're open for dialogue. And as I said many times, we're on the making, so we're not done. We're hoping to have a more ground-based discussion in April in Oakland in psychedelic science. It's not within our immediate mission right now to do that. At the moment, we're trying to create knowledge, access to information, and give advice. If in the future we might have a more active role, that is not something we know right now. So we're building this. Our job is to try the best we can with the information we can to provide scientific evidence. I also want to tell everybody that we are going to host the next webinar. I want to invite everybody to be present. It's going to be Tuesday, April 4th, from 4 to 5:30 p.m. in Barcelona time. It will be about DMT and ayahuasca, what is the difference and what are the similarities. It will be given by José Carlos Bozo, Constanza Sanchez, and myself. I invite you all to come. I want to thank the three panelists for their time and their goodwill and their efforts in preparing this. I want to thank our team. I want to especially thank Ben DeLona, that is the executive director of ICEERS and member of the steering committee of the ADF, for his positive vision in creating this fund, this great initiative. I want to thank all the steering committee, Ben Christie, Andrea Langlois, that is doing the communications of the ADF, Constanza Sanchez, and I also want to thank Jeronimo Mazaraza, who is our techie, our web guy between the webinar. And I'd like to conclude saying that we're going to be posting this video online. So keep tuned on the ADF Facebook, the ADF newsletter, and our communications. Thank you, everybody, for your participation, and hope to see you in the next webinar. Thanks. Bye-bye.